All right. Hello and welcome to part two of a cell transport mini lecture series. Hopefully, you watched the first one and filled out your cell transport notes. I want to just show you real quickly what that looks like in your OneNote. So this is what you should be filling out. If you double click in any of these spaces, you should be able to add a box and add some text to it. Just as a reminder, you are adding the definition of the word or the term that's in the box, and then any extra notes to help you understand the concept. Especially for osmosis, notice that there's not a space for isotonic, hypertonic, and hypotonic. So that might be something that you add in this box here to understand osmosis, okay? Now you'll notice that all of the passive types of transport are here on the right-hand side. So you have diffusion, osmosis, and facilitated diffusion, which we'll get to in this video. And all of the active transport types are over here on the left-hand side, which we're going to do in this video. Any extra notes like compare and contrast, you can add underneath active transport and passive transport. Okay. All right, so let's get going with part two. You learned about some passive types of transport that don't require any energy. We talked about diffusion, which is the movement of molecules. We talked about osmosis, which is the movement of water, and the three types of osmosis types. We had iso, hyper, and hypotonic. So remember that you can go back to that video at any point in time. I will also give you the YouTube link just so that you don't have to go to Edpuzzle for that. So we're going to continue in this video with passive transport first. So there are types of molecules that do have difficulty crossing through that lipid bilayer, okay? And they are called polar molecules. So lipids like molecules to be what we call nonpolar. But if it's a different type of molecule, which you'll learn about polarity in chemistry, it can't pass through that bilayer. In this case, we are going to need what we call a transport protein to help these molecules pass through the membrane more easily. So, these polar molecules are going to pass directly through a protein without even coming in contact with the lipid bilayer. Okay, so this is my protein channel here, or what I call a transport protein. And it will take things from this extracellular fluid, okay, which means outside of the cell, into the cell if it can't pass through this portion right here. Okay, so it will just allow it to pass right through. This is what we call facilitated diffusion, okay? Because these proteins are doing what we call facilitating or helping the diffusion of these molecules across the membrane. Okay, so think about what it means to facilitate. So let's say that you're facilitating a group of fifth graders in their reading. Okay, you're helping them read, right? So the word facilitate just means to help the diffusion of these molecules across the membrane. It is still considered passive transport, okay, or no energy, because the solute or the molecule, whatever it is, salt, potassium, the molecule is moving down its concentration gradient, okay? And remember, when we move down our concentration gradient, we are always moving from a high to a low concentration. So here's an example of facilitated diffusion. You can see that I have more molecules on the outside of my cell. Okay, I've got a bunch of these little squares on the outside of my cell. That's a high concentration. And I have none, okay, or now I have one after some transport, but virtually no molecules on the inside of my cell. So because these things are going from a high to a low concentration, this is still called passive transport. Facilitated diffusion is going to just speed up the passage of that solute by providing a passage through the membrane. It does not alter the direction of transport at all, and you can kind of see another example here. Okay, so the protein might open up on one end and then take it to the other end of the cell to leave. Now we're going to move on to active transport. So by now, at this point, you should have the entire right side of your notes filled out in OneNote. If you have not yet done that, make sure you go back and maybe rewatch the first video and add your notes because it is 10 points for this week. For active transport, this is going to be the notes on the left-hand side of your Venn diagram. So make sure that you add these notes there. So materials will sometimes move against the concentration gradient, okay? Now, in this situation, we are going to have things moving from a low to a high concentration gradient. Okay, now this is the opposite of what normally happens. Okay, so we're going from low to high. Because this is not the natural way of things, we are going to need energy to accomplish it. Okay, so diffusion, osmosis, facilitated diffusion, things just going from a high to a low concentration, there's no energy needed for that. Okay, I want you to think about when you spray perfume or like Axe in a room. Okay, when you spray it, it diffuses across the air with no energy. Okay, active transport will require energy because we're going from a low to a high concentration. That's not the natural way of things. So here's an example, okay? I see these little orange boxes here. I've got 2 on the outside of my cell, and I have 5 on the inside of my cell. So I'm trying to get these orange boxes from a low concentration to a high concentration, and it can be done here with my protein, but I'm going to need energy. So that's this yellow thing here, that's energy. So it depends on how big or small the molecule is on how it will get through. If you have small molecules that needs to be transported across the membrane against the concentration gradient from low to high, it is going to need a protein pump. A protein pump are going to need lots and lots and lots of energy, okay? An example is your sodium-potassium pump. This is important in nerve responses, okay? Have you ever gotten a cramp maybe in your foot or in your calf when you're working out, okay? This is literally a direct correlation to your sodium-potassium pumps. You actually need more potassium in your body if you have a cramp somewhere, and this is, again, directly related to a nerve response, okay? Your sodium-potassium pump is an example of a protein pump. Here you can see that we are going to be moving things in and out, okay? My sodium is going to be the little pink molecules, and my potassium is going to be the little green molecules, okay? So what happens is, as the potassium comes into the cell, the sodium will leave, and I want you to take a look at this thing right here. This is energy, okay? The energy needs to be connected to the protein pump in order for these molecules to pump in and out. Another example that I showed you at the end of the first video was Drake doing his little dance here, and this is an example of the sodium-potassium pump, okay? Make sure that you remember this. It could be some extra credit somewhere, somehow. Drake is moving the potassium, which is my K here, molecules into the cell, and the sodium molecules, those are being kicked out of the cell, and there is energy being used in this process, which is ATP. This is the sodium-potassium pump. So those are for small, the sodium-potassium pump or the protein pump, those are for small molecules moving against the concentration gradient. If I have larger molecules that need to move in and out of the cell, this is going to need something else. There are 2 types of active transport to help things move in and out of the cell. Endocytosis is what we call the process of taking materials into the cell by means of infoldings or pockets of the cell membrane. So basically, what the cell does is the cell membrane reaches out. If it's a big molecule, it reaches out, it gives the molecule or the thing a hug, basically, wraps its cell membrane arms around it, and then it comes in and forms kind of this little vacuole thing that has or contains whatever that nutrient is. Okay, so the pocket will break loose from the cell membrane and form that vacuole within the cytoplasm. This is going to be things like food and large molecules. That's how it gets into the cell. Again, requires lots of energy, right? The cell membrane is essentially reaching out with its little arms and making a whole vacuole. That's lots of energy. So here's just the two types of endocytosis. So again, make sure that you include this in your notes. The first type is going to be phagocytosis. This is large food particles. The second type is what we call pinocytosis. This is cellular drinking, and essentially it is fluid. So it's extracellular fluid. It's not fluid that's needed, but the molecules will be dissolved in the droplets. Okay, so it's basically pinocytosis is water or fluid, and phagocytosis is food or other large molecules. Okay, so notice that in my endocytosis, the cell is wrapping around and engulfing it in a vacuole. Well, that's things going into the cell. Now we need a way for things to exit the cell. So exocytosis is things leaving the cell, or the release of large molecules from the cell. What happens is kind of the exact opposite as endocytosis. So whatever that stuff is, the waste or whatever the cell doesn't need, is in a vacuole already. That vacuole will fuse or connect with the cell membrane, forcing the contents out of the cell. Okay, so here it's kind of the exact opposite. I have my stuff in the vacuole. It moves closer to the membrane. It fuses or connects with the membrane, and then it expels the waste or whatever it is the cell does not need. So endo in, exo out. All right, we are now at the end of our types of cell transport. We're going to be doing practice with this week, and you'll have a check for understanding or a mini quiz on Friday over all of this material. But I want to make sure that you guys understand the difference between passive and active transport. Passive transport does not require energy, right? Think about what the word passive means. If you're a passive type of person, you kind of are slower, you aren't like super outgoing. So passive does not require energy. It's kind of like riding a bike down a hill, okay? So when you ride a bike down a hill, you don't have to pedal. You're starting at a high place and you're going to a low place. It is high concentration, lots of molecules, to low concentration. Okay, think about the example of diffusion of perfume molecules. Okay, so you spray some perfume next to you. You're probably going to smell it first, and then your brother or sister, or your parents on the other side of the room, they will smell it later. Okay, it is the diffusion of molecules, and we have diffusion, which is just regular molecules. We have osmosis, which is water molecules, and facilitated diffusion using a protein. Active transport will require energy, okay? It's kind of like riding a bike up a hill. You're starting at a lower place, going to a higher place, and you're putting in work. It, again, is my low concentration to high concentration, the opposite kind of way of the world against the natural way. We have protein pumps for this, and we have endocytosis and exocytosis, which are also types of active transport. All right, that is the end of your cell transport lectures. Please make sure that you fill this out. Okay, you should now have all of it completely filled out with the definition as well as any extra notes to help you. This is 10 points for this week for your asynchronous lesson, and it's going to be the number one place that you will go to study.